The desert wind swept through El Rio Canyon, carrying sand and weathered memories. Elena Morales stood still on the rocky ridge, looking down at the village where she had been born and cast out. Years ago, the mixed blood in her veins had been used as an excuse for them to turn their backs on her. She left with nothing but shame and her father's old gun, never looking back. Now, she had returned not to seek forgiveness. 3 days earlier, a dying soldier had collapsed at the door of the trading post where she worked. With his last broken words, he warned of a band of deserters sweeping through the region, looting, burning, killing. Their next stop would be El Rio. Elena knew that village had never truly considered her one of their own, but her mother lay buried in this soil. The children of El Rio bore no guilt for the sins of their elders, and she could not turn away from evil, even when it threatened the very place that had rejected her. As she rode into the square, eyes followed her as if she were a ghost. The contempt was still there, but Elena did not lower her head. She had not returned as someone begging to be accepted. She had returned as a warning. The door of the mission house closed behind Elena, but the air inside was colder than the desert wind outside. The elders sat in a half-circle, their eyes wary, as if she carried a sickness rather than dire news. Elena relayed the dying words of the deserter, a force of 30 to 40 men, once soldiers, now an organized band of raiders. They did more than steal, they burned everything. They left nothing behind but ashes and bodies. And they were moving toward El Rio, 2 days away, at most. Whispers rippled through the room. Some claimed she was exaggerating. Others suspected she had invented the story just to find her way back. After what had happened years ago, they were not quick to trust someone long labeled as not belonging here. Sheriff Joaquin Reyes stood near the doorway. He was her half-brother, same father, different mothers, and the man who had stayed silent when she was forced to leave. His gaze was torn between duty and the weight of the past. "Why would you help us?" one elder asked, his voice sharp as a blade. Elena met their eyes. "Because my mother is buried in this ground, and because the children outside don't deserve to die just because you hate me." Silence fell over the room. At last, Joaquin spoke. "If she's telling the truth, then we have only 2 days to prepare." Trust had not yet arrived, but fear had begun. As the sun drifted westward, El Rio was no longer a village sleeping beneath layers of dust and time. The sound of hammers striking wood, metal clashing against metal, and whispered prayers blended into air stretched tight as a drawn wire. Under Elena's direction, the square quickly became a makeshift fortress. Sandbags were stacked along the northern approach, where the canyon narrowed into a natural choke point. Older gunmen wiped down rifles that had not been used in years. Young men were assigned to watch from rooftops. Women and children were moved into the church cellar. Elena moved from group to group, adjusting positions, pointing out weak spots, reminding them not to spread themselves thin, but to focus on key defensive lines. She thought like someone shaped by war, not with emotion, but with strategy. Joaquin watched her from a distance. He kept his space, but no longer argued. When Elena suggested posting a lookout on the southern hillside in case the attackers shifted toward the riverbed, he gave a brief nod. Amid shouted orders and hurried footsteps, their eyes met. "You let them drive me away," Elena said quietly. Joaquin tightened his grip on his gun belt. "And you chose to leave. No one won that exchange." But as night fell, they stood on the same side of the line, not as siblings, but as two people determined to see El Rio survive until dawn. Before dawn could paint the desert gold, the first gunshot tore through the sky over El Rio. The bullet slammed into the church bell tower, shattering brick that rained down into the square like gritty dust. A heavy moment of silence followed, then a second shot rang out, closer, more vicious. The enemy had arrived. From the northern hillside and the dry riverbed, riders emerged through clouds of red dust. Not a chaotic mob, but a disciplined formation, moving with purpose. 30, maybe 40 men. And behind them, on a high rocky outcrop, a man in a black coat watched it all unfold. "Elias Ford," Elena murmured as she recognized him through her sights. The first assault struck the northern barricade. Wood splintered, horses screamed, shouts and gunfire collapsed into chaos. A few young shooters trembled, nearly dropping their weapons. Elena surged forward, dropping to one knee in front of them, raised her rifle, and fired. The lead rider fell. The second wheeled his horse and fled. "Hold your positions," she shouted. "Don't spray your shots." On the church steps, Joaquin barked orders, forming a firing line. From the southern hillside, Mateo fired a signal shot, warning that the attackers were splitting into two groups. El Rio had no retreat left. As the stench of gunpowder smoke swallowed the square, their fight for survival truly began. The second assault hit even harder, as if Ford meant to crush El Rio's spirit through relentless pressure. Gunfire poured down from seized rooftops, forcing the villagers to fall back toward the center. Gun smoke mixed with desert dust, thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. Then flames erupted in the eastern quarter. A torch flew through the window of the old bakery, and within moments the fire devoured the dry, rotting roof. Children's cries pierced the choking smoke. Elena didn't hesitate. She rushed into the burning building, wrapping her jacket over her mouth, searching through the suffocating darkness. She carried a young boy out, just seconds before the roof collapsed behind her. Outside, the shooting never stopped. Joaquin took a light wound to the leg but kept fighting. Mateo moved between positions, resupplying ammunition and holding the southern flank. Farmers, blacksmiths, traders, people who had never imagined themselves carrying weapons now returned fire with eyes no longer ruled by fear. Many fell. Blood soaked into the soil where seeds had once been planted. But El Rio did not break. Amid fire and screaming, Elena stood her ground, her face smeared with ash and dust. She was no longer fighting for the past. She was fighting for the people standing behind her. And for the first time, the village began to see her as one of their own. When night fell, El Rio did not sink into silence. It merely changed its soundscape, from gunfire to groans of pain and muffled prayers inside the chapel. The wounded were carried in and laid shoulder to shoulder on the cold stone floor. A young man had lost too much blood. Beatrice knelt beside him, her hands stained red but steady. "He needs blood," she said simply. Elena didn't hesitate. She pulled off her glove and offered her arm. "Take mine," and described down. As her blood flowed through the crude tubing, dizziness washed over her. Old battlefield memories surged back, the scrape of scalpels, the harsh white lights, the distant reassurance of medics long ago. But this time was different. Not because of orders, not for medals or glory, but for a village that had once turned its back on her. Joaquin stood in the doorway, watching. The caution in his eyes was gone, replaced by something heavier, perhaps regret. When the young man stirred and whispered Elena's name in his delirium, another kind of silence filled the room. No one apologized. No one reopened old wounds. Yet in that moment, the invisible line between her and them began to fade. Outside, Mateo continued reinforcing the defenses. The elderly carried water. The young took turns standing watch. No one asked anymore whether Elena belonged here. That night, El Rio did more than resist its enemies. They began to stand together. After 2 waves of attacks, Elena understood one thing clearly. If they kept trying to hold every alley and every wall, El Rio would collapse from exhaustion before dawn. They didn't have enough people, not enough ammunition, but they still had their minds. "We tighten the perimeter," she said to Joaquin and Mateo in the smoke-choked square. "Abandon the outer edges, pull them into the center, turn every passage into a trap." At first, some protested. Leaving their homes behind felt like admitting defeat. But Elena shook her head. "We're not losing. We're changing how we fight." In less than half an hour, El Rio transformed. Families were moved into the church and the strongest buildings. Barrels of tar and oil were positioned at choke points. Ropes were strung across paths where horses might charge. Rooftops became sniper nests. Darkness became an ally. When the enemy horns sounded again, the riders surged into the square, believing the defenses had finally broken. Then the ground beneath them erupted. Fire flared from both sides of the alleys. Bullets rained down from above. Elena moved through smoke and flame like a shadow, issuing orders, firing back, dragging the wounded to safety. Joaquin fought at her side, without argument, without hesitation. El Rio was no longer merely defending itself. They were making every step the enemy took cost blood. Amid the smoke-filled square and flickering firelight, Elena heard a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Still haven't learned how to quit, Elena Vargas? She turned. Elias Ford stood at the edge of the square, his black coat dust-covered, his eyes cold as steel. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't panicking, he was simply watching, as if everything were unfolding exactly as planned. You should pull back, Elena said, raising her rifle. This isn't a hunt anymore. Ford gave a soft laugh. You still think you can save someone. How many more have to die before you prove that? 2 shots rang out almost at the same time. One grazed Elena's shoulder, knocking her off balance. The other slammed into Ford's shoulder. He staggered back a step, gripping his gun tightly. For a brief moment, as the smoke thinned between them, they stared at each other, like remnants of the same old war, 2 survivors of different battles, choosing opposite paths. You're no different from me, Ford snarled. Elena shook her head. I am. I remember who I was before I picked up a gun. Ford retreated before he could be fully surrounded. His men began to scatter as the sky lightened with the first hints of dawn. El Rio was still standing, but the cost lay scattered across the square. And Elena knew that as long as Ford lived, this fight was not truly over. As dawn revealed scorched walls and blankets laid over the dead, El Rio understood they could not simply wait for the next attack. Ford would return with more men, more ammunition, more fire. Elena stood in the ruined square, her gaze no longer fixed on defense alone. We have to make him doubt, she said, not just with guns, with fear. The plan began that very afternoon. Tripwire traps were strung along the canyon paths. Spike pits were dug and concealed beneath a thin layer of sand. Broken saddles and blood-stained scraps of cloth were hung from tree branches like wordless warnings. Symbols of fire and markings that looked like ancient rites were carved into the cliff faces. When night fell, Elena lit the first torch on the hillside. One by one, flames ignited, forming a ring of light around El Rio, a circle of defiance. From afar, Ford's men saw the fires and the strange signs. Rumors spread through their camp that El Rio was not merely a village, but a cursed place, a land that swallowed intruders whole. Ford did not withdraw completely, but the certainty within his ranks began to fracture, and for the first time, fear no longer belonged only to El Rio. Ford would not accept being humiliated by the fires on the hills. He led what remained of his men into the canyon one last time, determined to burn El Rio down to the last stone. But this time, El Rio was ready. As his formation pushed deep into the narrow pass, the traps sprang. Ropes cinched tight around horses' legs. Spike pits swallowed the men at the front. From above, bullets and arrows poured down like rain. Oil was dumped along the retreat route, flames roaring up to cut off any escape. Elena led the counterattack, not with trained soldiers, but with farmers, blacksmiths, and mothers who had once trembled behind closed doors. Joaquin fought at her side. Mateo held the mountainside. Even Beatrice moved through the smoke with a lantern and a knife in hand. Ford was driven into a corner of the alley, his gun shaking. You're no different from me, he snarled. Elena studied him for a long moment. I am. I chose to protect, not to take. The final shot rang out. This time, he did not rise again. Weeks later, El Rio began planting its fields anew. Children laughed by the well. When federal cavalry arrived to investigate, they found only a town still standing, no longer an easy target. Elena was no longer an outcast. She became a story the desert wind carried across the frontier. If this story of resilience moved you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more Wild West stories.